Public money is ultimately built on public trust. Governments have to borrow, they have to invest, and they have to build airports, roads, hospitals, and power grids. And sometimes they need financial tools that can look beyond the next budget cycle. The National Investment Fund was created to be one of those tools. But over the last few days, questions surrounding hundreds of millions of dollars moving into and subsequently out of that fund have turned an obscure piece of financial legislation into a national conversation. Where did the money go? Who authorized its movement, and what safeguards were supposed to be in place? Tonight, we're taking the politics out of the headline long enough to understand the machinery behind it. Welcome to On the Record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. Stick with us. Our show begins on the other side of this break. This is On the Record. Welcome to our show. The National Investment Funds Act establishes a structure comprising a board of governors, investment oversight, reporting requirements, and audits. But what does all of that mean in practice? My guest tonight is Marlon Johnson, a former acting financial secretary for the government of the Bahamas. He's currently serving as chief operating officer at the TCI Financial Services Commission. Marlon, welcome to On the Record, and thank you for joining us via Zoom tonight. We're going to jump right in now. Let's start really with what exactly is a National Investment Fund, and why would something like this be created in the Bahamas?
So, as your viewers may recall, the National Investment Fund really is a recast of the existing Sovereign Wealth Fund legislation, which itself was passed several years before. Bahamians have been familiar with the term of Sovereign Wealth Funds, and that there's been a lot of agitation over the years for the creation of such a fund. The former administration created the fund, but certainly events overtook that last administration, first with the Hurricane Dorian and then with the pandemic. And so, although legislation was put in place, there really was no significant movement. The current administration decided to recast the Sovereign Wealth Fund into a National Investment Fund, which essentially sought to do the same things. Importantly, it is predicated in the legislation upon the Santiago Principles, which speak to how sovereign wealth funds ought to be structured. And the aim was very well articulated by the Prime Minister during the discussion and debate on the actual act and the bill. And those are really to make sure that you can mobilize public assets, public savings. And those public assets could be land, could be buildings, it could be natural resources, it could be surplus revenues. And you would then invest those national assets for long-term gains for your citizenry. So in very broad terms, that's what the National Investment Fund is. That's its purpose, to try to mobilize public resources, private resources, in a way that would benefit the development of the country.
So what does something like this, or what problems does this solve for a country, or what problems does this potentially solve for the country? I think you listed a few things that the fund is used for, but what problems is it designed to solve?
So it depends on the country. So there's two real drivers for this. Normally, when you hear of sovereign wealth funds, you think of places like Norway, you think of Saudi Arabia, you think now of Guyana, where your actual revenues that are being generated from resources are in surplus. And what do I mean by that? Where the government is taking in much more cash resources than it could possibly make use of in a given year. So what countries have done over the years, instead of trying to just find ways to just spend money every year, they create a savings fund. So it's like a long-term investment vehicle to put in those surplus funds. And then when those surplus funds are put in, they are obviously intended for long-term gain. So that's generally when you hear sovereign wealth funds, that is where that happens. In the Bahamas, we don't have that luxury of having surplus resources. So what our aim was to say, what resources do we have? And with the primary one is really land, and any other resources that we're able to marshal. How can we take that? And this is where it comes important for us. We are creating an independent vehicle where we can marshal resources and then partner with private sector actors. So, for example, if we need to construct, let's say, a new port in one of the islands, you could then take those public resources, you could then find private capital, and the government and the private investors can invest together. And the returns from that investment now go into an independent fund. It doesn't go into the consolidated fund, it goes into the independent managed fund that would have a mandate to take those returns and then reinvest them to create generational long-term wealth that the government can then use for whatever set of ongoing developmental needs that it would have.
And did this piece of legislation accurately do that? Set up this fund to be for those funds to be able to go there?
Yeah. Now, normally people get scared of legislation because they are those can be cumbersome. But this legislation, I thought, was and is a very elegant piece of legislation. I think it very well, in a very straightforward way, set up the right structure. There is supposed to be an independent board of governors, as you said outright. I think it's a 4 or 5 member board of governors, one representative from the public sector in the form of a representative from the central bank, 4 independent directors, and it sets up the governance structure to be clearly the fund is to be managed by this independent board of governors. It requires an investment committee. It requires an external auditor to be named, and it requires it, importantly, to be governed along those same Santiago principles I spoke about, which are to ensure open accountability, transparency, proper reporting, proper decisions made on investment returns. So structurally, I think the government did a fantastic job in creating the right kind of vehicle for such a fund.
So to be clear to our viewers, building or upgrading airports can legitimately fall within the purposes envisioned in this act, correct?
Yes, but I think it's be careful, because governments, if a government wants to fund any public project like an airport or a port, what the investment fund would be looking at is, for the fund itself, is it structured in a way that is going to generate specific returns? So, for example, if the fund is going to invest in airports, that's fine, it can, to answer your question directly, certainly. But then they would need to receive a business case to show you how the fees, the rents from the airport, these things will actually contribute to create positive net income that will then pay back, give returns on investments to the fund, and that is established on commercial terms. There's clear understanding if there's a default, if something happens, this is the stake that the fund would have. So yes, the part of the purpose of this fund was to fund what we call commercial public sector projects that can be funded and generate economic returns to actually build the fund. What the fund was not designed to do was to be a means just to fund public works directly in the absence of all the other things I referenced.
Which brings me now to my next question. From all indications, what you were describing previously in terms of what is supposed to happen, are there any indications that any of that happened, or are all indications pointing to just these funds being sent for airport developments?
Well, honestly, Jerome, that's the question that's left unanswered. I think what the government has said is that they will issue a report in due course outlining these things. However, again, going back to one of the core principles of a sovereign wealth fund and national investment fund is the principle around transparency. In fact, the legislation requires the fund to have a website where all of these decisions and all of this information is to be known. And I think the answer is we don't know. It could be, but we haven't been given, I think, some very basic information that would allow the public to be comforted that these were discrete investments from the fund, that the board of governors of the fund made the decision, there was consideration, and that there is a clear business case that underrode these particular decisions.
I wanted to speak to the fact that the legislation is set up in a way, or is it set up in a way that the minister can act outside of the board, or does every transaction or every movement have to come through that board?
Yeah, the minister is empowered by the act to give broad directions to the board, but the entirety of the decisions themselves, the decision to open a bank account is a board decision. The decision to invest must, again, by virtue of the Santiago principles, come through the board. The minister can certainly and the minister has a responsibility and to be able to direct the board as to the general direction of the fund. But these decisions are intended to be made by the management of the board and done in a way where there's, again, a clear indication as to the reasons, the rationale, and the business case that underwrites any decisions made with the monies in the fund.
Given how this information was made public, and just to help the audience to put it into context, these are questions raised by the opposition about these funds and the redirected, as we've been describing it, the redirected funds, or the use of those funds. Given the way that this was presented to the public, does that automatically raise suspicions or cast doubt over the process?
I mean, frankly, yes. I think if I were advising the government, I think there are very straightforward answers to these questions. You conceded, or you made it known that the funds were primarily used for airports, which raises a question as to primarily means that some was used for the airports, most was used for the airports. What other things were funded? And just to give who the board of the fund is, these are the specific projects that they have funded. This was the business case that underwrote it. These are the anticipated returns. This is how that process works. And importantly, if the fund is making an investment, what is the nature of that investment? Because a fund, the way that it's structured, would not just be paying vendors for work done. The fund would have some stake. Does the fund own a share of the company operating the airport? Did the fund get bonds that is expected to be paid back? So my advice to anyone involved in this is just to present the information that spoke to the decisions, because it could very well all be consistent with the legislation, and those questions should have a very, very straightforward answer.
The Act refers separately to an investment mandate and a policy mandate. What are those, and why should the public care whether they exist and have been published?
Because, of course, so first of all, one of the interesting things about the fund that we set up is that the government made the decision to borrow a substantial sum of money and to deposit it into the fund. That it's not unprecedented, but it's not typically the way funds are capitalized. But again, that's at the discretion of government. So from what the government has said, somewhere around $700 million, according to what the Minister of Finance said, was put into the fund. And so that money is borrowed become obligations that we as Bahamians have to pay back. So to answer your question, that's why we ought to be concerned. It's a substantial sum of money. And given the way that the law is structured, and given the fact that I think most Bahamians are keen to know that a sovereign wealth fund is going to be doing what it says, invest in funds, generate returns for us and those who come after us, we would want to be assured that the law is being followed and that the monies are being utilized consistent with that. What I think the concern is that what all of us want to ensure is that the fund wasn't used just as a way to go by the normal budgetary processes and find an alternate way for governments to fund it to avoid some of the bureaucracy. Because that, again, would run counter to the purpose of the law and the letter of the law.
So again, if that is the case, and this is hypothetically speaking, if that is the case, what is the danger of that, and what kind of precedents does that set? I mean, it sounds initially like government would have operated outside of the legislation, but if that is the case, how dangerous is that?
I think what we want to do at all times in anything involving national life is, again, the transparency. It's important for us to understand what liabilities are being set up in our names. When we're talking $265 million, whether it's $700 million, these are not immaterial sums. These are sums that we are going to have to pay back. These are sums that those who come after us, when you and I are long retired, others are going to have to pay back. So it's going to be that know and understand what those liabilities are because they become part of the debt burden. And that's why the entire budgetary framework is set up. That's why the reporting framework is set up. We would not want to know that there's $200 million, $300 million being expensed, being paid out, and there are no appropriate checks and balances, approvals, reporting in respect to those sums, because those are significant and those are monies that we are going to have to pay back collectively.
I want to go back to something that you mentioned, the fact that I think some people may have overlooked it, that these monies were borrowed to put into this fund. And this is a basic financial question, but is it prudent, is it wise to borrow money to then put in a savings or in a fund like this? Is that a prudent thing in financial services to do or in finance to do?
If you are going to borrow it in a way where you can demonstrate that you are going to earn more back from it. So in other words, if I'm borrowing, say, the $200 million, and I'm investing it in an airport project that will yield me back the $200 million plus a return, then that would fall under the acceptable parameters. But that's, again, there are no guarantees in life in any investment. But that's what you would want to be able to explain. We borrowed these monies because we found it necessary to invest it. But the immediate question I would then ask is, why would it go through the National Investment Fund? Most Bahamians would understand the need to borrow monies to construct an airport because those are critical infrastructure. And there is a budgetary process that allows for that. And if all it is that we need to borrow monies to build an airport, the immediate question is, well, that ought to go through the regular budgetary channel. There's no need to put it in the National Investment Fund because the kinds of investments that fund would do, you wouldn't get a returns if it's all that you're doing is going to build the airport. So that, I think, is why that becomes important. There are already mechanisms to do borrowing and straight public investment, and the National Investment Fund was intended to do something different.
Again, just coming from a place of trying to seek knowledge, could this fund potentially be used to help us out in the event of a disaster? Let's say hypothetically, we've got a hurricane in another 2 months at the level of a Dorian or a little less. Would funds in the NIF be able to assist in the recovery effort or not?
The short answer is no. The fund isn't set up as a disaster relief fund. Now, it may be a good idea for the government to set up, say, listen, we want to create a vehicle whereby we put a special levy or special fee, and that goes into disaster recovery fund. Those kinds of ideas have been broached before. But a National Investment Fund would not do that. How a National Investment Fund would be able to help in the disaster recovery is after several years of us making investments that generate returns. If we want to take those returns, the profits, so to speak, and then use the profits and returns to help with disaster recovery, then that's fine. But you don't want to consume capital. That money in the fund is there for investing. And investing is something different from spending. We all know that in our personal life. Investing is something you do with an anticipation for a specific financial return. And that's why I go back to the example of the airports. If they are investing in the airport to create a company, and the fees and all of the rents and everything from that airport allows you to get a return on that investment, then it would qualify. If the monies are going into the fund just to pay for the actual airport to be done, to pay off the vendors and builders and contractors, without that clear articulation of, I own a piece of the airport, the fund own the piece of the airport or own some asset that it can call on, then again, we're moving outside of what the fund is intended to do or what the fund legally ought to be able to do.
I want to talk a little bit about the role of the investment committee and what role that committee is supposed to play. Is it merely an advisory committee, or does it actually make investment decisions?
No, it's an advisory committee, but it's an important one because in any of these types of structures, they would be the people, it could be members of the board, and they can, of course, have people outside of the board who will sit down and actually take a look at what's being proposed. Because again, it isn't sufficient. We all technocrats can put together any pretty business case. It's important that you have people who are knowledgeable who will sit down and say, yes, well, hang on. Will this airport really be able to generate this level of usage so that you know that it's generating sufficient user fees, rents? Are the projections realistic? Do we have the proper security? Do we have the proper collateral? What happens if is it properly insured? All of these things to ensure the integrity of the actual fund capital. So that is where that investment committee becomes important. They wouldn't make the decisions, but they would then be the ones that refer to the board. One of the key elements of that Santiago principles is that that board itself should be the one that can independently make the decision as to whether to invest or not. Not a minister, not a cabinet, not a politician, but the board itself, and informed by whatever the mandate they've been given by the government.
I
So
think
the government should be
very
informing their mandate, but the board should be the ones making the decisions.
You raised a very important point. If that board, which is supposed to be independent, is making the decisions on how those funds need to be invested based on the advice of the committee, does that not then take out the political element?
Well, that's the purpose of having. That's exactly right. That's the purpose of setting these things up, because we all understand the political pressures. You know, our politicians have a 5-year horizon; they have to deliver. So again, I think part of the great design of the legislation we have, and again, I go back to say that I think the legislation is designed is that it does create this board of governors to make these decisions. And so, and they will be, the politicians has influence because they could, again, set the broad policy mandate. But you want in these kinds of funds, the board to have the independence to make the decisions in line with what the policy mandates are. And they can then help the government to say, yes, we know you want to create an airport and you want us to invest in airports, but these are the kinds of things and considerations that would be necessary to ensure that we are creating an investment that can pay for itself over time and generate long-term generational wealth for the fund.
And again, in a hypothetical situation, if a board has not yet been constituted, can the machinery contemplated by this act properly function?
No, it can't function at all, not in any legitimate way. So because the board, if you look at the legislation, it seems like you've looked at it already. One of the things that the legislation is clear on is that the board shall set up the bank account for this entity. Jerome, so to receive the $700 million in the first place, there would need to be a duly constituted board. So it's important that that board is there to receive the money, and then that board is the one who would then make the investments decision. So if there is no duly constituted board, then it raises the question as to any legitimacy of the transactions related to the fund. And so one of the very first questions that I think this has been asked by the press and asked by the opposition and others is, who were the board members? And because that board can then be asked some very direct questions about the nature of the transactions.
So the government has indicated that they will be providing a report and providing an accounting of specifically where the monies were used. What kinds of things should the public be looking for in that report? What kinds of things should we be paying attention to and listening for to ensure that this was done within the framework of the legislation?
Well, the first thing I think you would ask for is when will we get the report? Because again, you've already had a substantial, by the government's own concession, you already had $265 million spent. So the very first question is that ought to be at least a preliminary report outlining what was done ought to be imminent. Who made the decisions and what areas they covered. Then once that substantive report is done, then we should be looking to that questions we broached earlier. Are these investments or are these just expenditures? And if there are investments, what did the fund buy with these investments? Did they get a share? Did they own parts of the airports? And is it they invested in what we call debt equity, meaning that they got bonds? What are the nature of the bonds? What are the returns on it? We would want to ensure ourselves that we've actually made investments and not just taken and not just spent money in paying for the airport. A fund isn't there to pay for an airport. It's there to invest in an airport with the anticipation that those investments will generate returns over time. So those would be the key things. And then are the other things, because you remember now, it was primarily the airports, which means that the fund was used to finance other things as well. What are those other things outside the airport, and do they also meet the criteria I just referred to?
I mean, and I think that is another question. I think one of the biggest questions that people have is the timing of it all. And again, when we look at when it happened in the context of a general election, that's raising even more questions. And again, whether perceived or actual, do these things begin to really chip away at the integrity?
Yeah, I think this is why my advice is that the government really come forward and just give a fulsome accounting. I'm going to be the eternal optimist and assume that there are suitable explanations. The sooner that those explanations come out, the better. Because you not only do you have the timing in front of an election, you have the fact that in December there was $265 million in the fund, and then by March, 3 months later, end of March, it had gone down to 200,000. That means $265 million was moved, spent, invested just in a 3 month period. That's an extraordinary sum of money for just 3 months. So the simple question is, give a listing of what transpired that would cause a drawdown of those sums and to where.
And again, which
very
265 million over 3 months seems like a very short period of time. Is that practical?
I would love to see how that played out. I'm assuming that the monies weren't all expensed in that 3 months, but that means that money then went into other accounts, perhaps for future, perhaps to pay bills that accumulated. Jerome, go back to the simple concept. The simple way to answer these questions is to answer these questions. You don't need, in my view, to have to wait for a statutory required report. The money has been spent. A board presumably has made a decision. Let's find out. I mean, the government just several months ago updated the list of over 100 boards and committees. This is a statutory required board from 2022. So that they weren't on that list. So first of all, tell the public, because these are the people who are managing $700 million of our money. Let's just get an accounting of who are the board members. And then let's just answer the questions now as to its operations.
2 minutes.
That at least lead us through the $265 million. I don't think it's unreasonable. I think it would clear up a lot of what may be simply misconceptions in the marketplace. And then we could move past this. But to your broader point, what we don't want to do is, having gone through the work of setting up what I believe to be a very credible legal framework for a national investment fund, we don't want to come out of the bat and already undermine it simply because we're not doing timely reporting on its transactions. So let's nip that in the bud, get the questions answered, and give the public the assurance that we have suitable answers to these queries that are in my mind just very, very reasonable.
Yep. Final question for us, and this is really looking ahead. The Act repeatedly refers to transparency, reporting, and publication. What should the ordinary Bahamian reasonably be able to find out about this fund in the future, for future reference, future occurrences, future oversight? Just the ordinary Bahamian, what kinds of things should we reasonably be able to find out about this fund whenever we desire?
So let's just think about it in any sort of fund of this type. What we should be able to do right now, because the fund the law requires a website. So that website should be up and functioning, given that by the government's own admission, the fund is operational. So we should today be able to go on the website, see who the board of members are, like you would see in any corporate website, see who the senior management are, if there any hired individual, and get a list of all approved projects in what amounts and for what purposes. And then any other accounting report. The law also requires us to know. The law also requires us them to name external auditors. So we should be able to go on the website and be able to find out who the appointed external auditors are. So then that gives us an understanding that there are appointed auditors and that we will eventually get the annual reports out. So that basic information would go a long way in at least allowing you, interested members of the public, to ask and get answers to very, very straightforward questions.
All right. Marlon, you've given us a lot of information, a lot to think about, a lot to process, and I think even more to look forward to whenever this report is made public and provided to us. So thank you very much. Thanks for speaking with us all the way from TCI. All the best to you. Thank you for always being so insightful and for giving us a lot to think about. All the best to you.
Thank you, Jerome. Always a pleasure.
All right. When we come back from the break, we move from how it was supposed to work to what actually happened. More than 265 million was reflected in the fund at the end of December, as you heard. 3 months later, almost all of it had moved. The government says airport infrastructure was a primary beneficiary. We'll tackle that when On the Record returns. Welcome back to On the Record. Government reporting showed that the fund held some 265 million at the end of December of 2025 and approximately 200,000 at the end of March. The government says those resources primarily supported airport infrastructure. Now, the opposition argues that critical questions remain about authorization, governance, and parliamentary oversight. My guest for this segment is Matt Aubry, the Executive Director of the Organization for Responsible Governance. Matt, welcome back to On the Record.
Always a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
All right. As we mentioned, government records show 265.3 million in the fund at the end of December, and then roughly 200,000 3 months later. From a public finance perspective, how extraordinary is a movement of that size over such a short period of time?
Well, I think it's important to kind of accept and look at the context of this. So the National Investment Fund is not the same as our other typical government funding and mechanisms. And it was established in 2022, really replacing the Sovereign Wealth Fund to be this entity that moved monies in different ways and was focused on how you invest assets and how you, in its own mandate, invest in blue and green and orange economy, new initiatives, climate financing components. So it is supposed to be facile in its way. And our experience with it is relatively limited. We haven't seen as much in this way. So for us to watch it and see it deplete and jump should be a concern. At the same time, there should be easy ways to clarify what that's about, right? The biggest challenge that I think we see with this scenario and others is often when there's a lack of access to information, what might be a straightforward question can become easily developed into a political controversy.
And there, once again, is that nagging Freedom of Information Act. All right, government says...
or critical Freedom of Information Act.
I say nagging because it always seems to be... We always seem to be moving the goalposts on getting it. Anyway, government says that the primary use was airport infrastructure. Now, does that explanation, standing alone, satisfy the accountability requirements?
So in the Act, it definitely talks about infrastructure. So off the cuff, it doesn't, that alone, you can't say that would be in or out. It would be how it's used and what it's supposed to be, how it's supposed to be not only accounted for, but how it's driven. So the Act talks about a level of independence. It talks about an operational and governance structure that is driven from a board that comprises a number of folks, including a central bank representative and folks who have experience in this, and the ability to move through. There's also some lack of clarity exactly as how monies are able to be moved, because there is a note in the Act about a ministerial function in terms of being able to move that. So it requires clarity, I think, and fundamentally that's going to be a trend as we look at this. This is supposed to be built with an institutionalized level of trust, whereby movements and actions within this fund should be understood from the public and should be easily understood from the public. So if there's not clarity as to why something happened or why it was invested in, or if there's discussion about it retroactively, it's kind of not in the spirit of the way this act was generated.
Do you think it has been compounded by how it was brought to the public, and that it was the opposition that sounded the alarm, as opposed to government saying, hey, we've redirected these monies and here's where it's gone?
And the Act, as often pieces of legislation do, are usually trying to meet a certain international mandate. This Act actually specifies that it is to be in compliance with the Santiago Principles. And the Santiago Principles are a set of principles put in place and managed by an international forum of sovereign wealth funds that has kind of looked at the fact that these types of funds can easily be co-opted or not used appropriately, and there could be concerns related to governance, financial management, oversight. So these principles are in place. This act actually references them specifically. And they are about the fact that there needs to be clear and transparent mechanisms. There needs to be independent authority, professional management, ongoing and annual assessment of is it compliant with these acts, a regular reporting, strict use and functions of how they're being regulated and how those are being reported. So those types of things would say that actually things should be identified earlier, and that there should be proactive information about how this is going to be used, and that it complies with an oversight and a strategy that is clear, that a board is understood, that there are places where the public can go to check and understand the mechanisms of how this is being used. These are all principles of good governance, and they are written into the act. Hence, the implication is that that's how the act is supposed to be executed.
Help us to understand, if you can, the difference between Parliament authorizing government to borrow money and Parliament appropriating money for a particular use.
So that's also right. The borrowing power and spending power are something we need to kind of distinguish within this process. Mm-hmm. So the fund was built out as was the Sovereign Wealth Fund prior to that, with the understanding that this was going to be money that was kind of put aside to be able to be held in trust for the Bahamian people. And the movement of this money is really in the space of what that board is able to establish. They're the ones that are able to hold the bank account. They're the ones that are able to draw and utilize the money, direct how it's used. In the way that Parliament functions to manage the overall consolidated fund, we see that process of a budget cycle, right, that is overseen and fed into, and information is brought forward, and a debate that's happened. So in this way, it's not always clear, and I think the question that needs to be able to be answered, and it could be a very straightforward answer, is what authority kind of took in the money, what authority determined this was how it was supposed to be used, how is that money released, and how does that then set up a precedent going forward, or is it in contrast to what the initial intent of this act was? Those questions need to be clearly responded to in order to meet the principles of the act.
If borrowed funds were first raised for one purpose and excess proceeds then later transferred into the NIF, what documented trail should exist? What should people be able to see? Okay, you've told me that these monies were borrowed for this particular purpose,
right?
Later transferred. What trail of documents should we be looking for?
So I think from the start, the Act references that there should be rules and regulations established. Those, I would assume, would have been gazetted, so there would be a gazetted process that says these are the mandated rules and regulations of how this is supposed to happen. It also references that there's supposed to be a website that you could go and find this information on, whether it's attached to the government website or an independent website, where you could be able to see how does money come in, how is that money reconciled, and then how does that ultimately dispersed, and what for purpose.
To your knowledge, do these websites exist?
I haven't seen anything. We did some looking over the last couple of weeks. I'm sure everyone has, and nothing that is directly available or easily searchable is, in my estimation.
Speaking of the Act, Section 10 of the Act says the minister may make regulations governing deposits, allocations, and withdrawals. How important is it to establish whether those regulations existed when these transactions occurred?
Again, going back to the Santiago principles, all of that is basically institutionalizing trust. All of those are setting that systems need to be in place to ensure that the use and the management of monies under a fund like this are clear and distinct. So understanding that there are rules and regulations means that there is something that the fund is going to be held itself accountable to. This is how we'll use these monies, this is what that process will be, this is where reconciliation will happen, and this is how that goes forward. So that if the minister sets regulations, that would be understood clearly, not something that you'd have to guess at, and it's not something to be made up on a circumstantial basis. The principle of the Act is that this will set up and drive the ongoing efforts of this Act in trust of the people's monies.
So, hypothetically, if there's no functioning board at the relevant time, and functioning boards, non-functioning boards are the result of many things, including an election. Who is legally capable of authorizing these transactions from what you've been able to see?
I don't think I would have an answer for that, and I think that's one of those ongoing questions is within the structure of this, again, clarity on who's on a board, what the function of that effort is. Were there some existing circumstances that drove this action at this time that could be clearly articulated or identified? Was there an authority process that was easily reconciled or recorded? These are things that, again, build trust. And you and I have had this conversation before, is that what we know is that there is this issue of trust in the world now, but in our country around interests of institutions, and do they represent the direct day-to-day interests of people in the communities? And knowing that that's an issue, this act, as it's written, really speaks to an intentional process that should show and demonstrate clear and comfortable trust that the system is something you can understand, something you can get information on, and then how that process will be used ongoingly. So I don't think it's without information, it's hard to make an assessment of, is this as it's supposed to be? Is this something that raises flags? Is this a matter of folks having to believe one political side versus another political side? When, in fact, what the Act really talks about is there should be processes and mechanisms that you could use to make your determination as to you feel it's in your best interest, and is it in the essence of what this law intends.
You talk about trust, and I think in this context, even the erosion of trust, which is not just in the Bahamian context, but as you have said, global. One of the things that was pointed out was the moment all of this happened in the months leading up to a general election. Even if it doesn't establish any wrongdoing, spending hundreds of millions shortly before an election, should it not demand a higher level of disclosure, particularly because of the potential perception?
Well, you would think intuitively that would make sense. But if you fall back to whatever the terms of the law are, whatever the regulations are in the Act, whatever the components are, as long as those are clearly established, then as long as you follow something consistently based on what the remit is, then timing may or may not play out to it, because there may be some existing circumstances that would drive an act. But if you can't see that, or people don't see that, then the inevitability is that they become skeptical or questioning or concerned in many instances, because there's not the level of clarity that this act was presented with, or that it's written into the terms of the act. These principles, as well as the overall statement of this is about transparency, and it's about having the capacity to develop national investments that can support the ongoing long-term development of the people.
I know, going back or looking ahead, I should say, the government has indicated that the information will be brought to the public. And at the end of the day, if it is found that this was done within the parameters of the law, and you could have done it, my question as a Bahamian is, should you have done it?
Mm-hmm. And I think that's the fundamental question within this, right? Is we've seen a lot of indicators right now about this issue of potential lack of trust or concerns. Probably most present would be the lack of folks showing up for the election, right? Mm-hmm. We saw those historic, high 80% drop down to 60s during COVID, and the assumption was it had maybe something to do with the health concerns at the time. But we see now that stayed pretty much the same within this last election. And that question of civic participation, which we're struggling with in many different spaces, is one that I would think we want to take very seriously. So at org, we do a lot of work on grassroots work, trying to help people to understand the systems that they're being governed by, the programs, the policies, and make sure that they have as much opportunity to understand it, but all more importantly, an opportunity to get involved and have their voice so that they build ownership. Because this is a mechanism like the fund or any of the types of legislation that really drive the financial use of a country's money are really about the long-term future, the long-term sustainability of a country, and we want people to understand that. We want people to be involved in it. If initiatives that are being driven for the blue, orange, and green economy are being put forward, we would hope that also speaks to and connects to our local economy, our local business owners, our community level folks, because that's where, if we can show a growth and success, it builds our resilience, it builds our potential, it grounds our local economic development.
I want to spend a little bit more time speaking to the law itself. It makes, or the legislation, the law makes the board responsible for overall management. Right? We've established that. Why is that separation between the minister and the independent board so important? Or is it important, or should it happen?
No, and it's a crucial point. It's in the Santiago Principles too, is that there is this distance between government, which has the function of ongoing management of our day-to-day systems, and then this structure, this fund, because it's too easy, as people can speculate, to draw from monies that you have allocated for a very special purpose that is about the long-term investment of public-private partnerships and infrastructure and other types of initiatives that really are outside of the day-to-day action, and what the day-to-day costs are. And so the distinction between government and this independent body are critical, because it frees up the understanding and the value that it doesn't have to link what government is doing, this fund will necessarily follow. And it also doesn't become, it's not supposed to become a kind of, secondary source of things to cover your ongoing revenue. There should be a distinct purpose for these investments, a strategy that, and a risk management strategy that is built into this fund. It speaks about it in the Act, and it also is referenced in the principles.
So government, as I said, has indicated that a full accounting is coming. What should, or what would be, I should say, the biggest red flag for each of us when that report eventually arrives?
Well, I guess one side or the other, that it would be too simple or too complex, right? Often we see there's lots of financial information that government does produce and is required to by the Public Finance Management Act. Or the Fiscal Responsibility Act prior to that, based on our budget process. But often you'll see information that comes out that's either really dense, so it's only going to be picked apart by those that are kind of in this industry, or way too simplified. And the truth is, something should be presented in a very straightforward, easy to understand, but in depth enough to really get the spirit of what is being done. So here's how money comes in, here's how money goes out. It doesn't have to be particularly detailed in every component or how this has been utilized, but it has to match what the strategy is put forward. It has to adhere to the regulations that are being put forward. And so ideally, as the Act says, being put in one space, in a website that the public can go to, I can look to see, here's who's in charge of this, here's what the strategy is, here's what's happened so far, here's what the different types of expenditures and allocations have been. How does that match up with what the strategy was, the rules were, and where we think this is going to go?
Should that include some justifications?
Well, most budgets should have justifications, right? Budgets should clarify not just numbers on a page, but what was being done. So a strategy and an analysis of what that budget is, as in best done, says these are what these numbers mean, and this is what you can look at that shows an indication of how that was done, or here's where we didn't meet our goal, or here's what something was done in excess, and here's the reason why. The exceptions always should be identified.
On the flip side of that, if government can establish that everything it did was technically legal, is that the end of the matter?
So it shouldn't be about one issue or not, right? This is not necessarily in our interest. The most important thing here is not whether something happened on that one time. It's what does this fund help to establish in the long run. The fund as an entity, and it's being used in a few different places. Similarly, the fund as an entity creates an opportunity for development that wouldn't happen normally. It minimizes to some degree the capacity and the risk of government money being used in this way. It sets pathways where investments for long-term growth in areas where we have great potential, which has been identified as the blue, the orange, the green economies. These are things that can be really a part of where a future sustainable economic development drive can happen. So in the way that it's written and in the way it's positioned, by and large, it could be a very positive element, but it has to be managed in a way that it doesn't become the forum for a political battle every time something happens, right? You want to make sure that it's built into your regular operational model, and that the public understands that. The Bahamians will know this is what that means. They may not know every detail or be adept on exactly investment strategy, but they understand what this is versus our regular consolidated fund and how those monies are being used.
They can see it, they can go online and access it, read it, digest it for themselves, draw their conclusions from the information.
Right. And we need to do work to help folks to be comfortable in that space. We actually have a program called Be Clear Bahamas that we've been running for the last 2 years that allows folks to understand what is that budgeting process? How do you get involved? How do you pay attention? What do those charts mean, and how do you analyze that? What are the sources of information? And we've seen with high schoolers and college students that a lot has come from that. Really interesting analysis. And it's not about get the government or hold this political party, but really how do we think about creating and contributing our own solutions?
How do we understand, again, to make informed decisions?
Right.
I want to move slightly, or I want to move the discussion slightly. I know we're here to talk about the National Investment Fund, but this other topic we cannot ignore. We've been talking a lot about accountability and how government spends money. The Prime Minister's national address this week raised another version of that same question, this time at BPL. Prime Minister says his administration inherited an electricity grid and generation system in extremely poor condition. Economically, is we inherited it a sufficient explanation for 5 years of governing? Or 5 years into governing?
Well, I don't know. When you're thinking about BPL, the fundamental issue for Bahamians is it's not about 5 years, and it's not about 10 years, and it's about 15 years and going back. That's something that has been structurally challenged throughout all that period of time. Subsequent administrations have put forward a plan. The plan either hasn't manifested or it's been changed upon a new administration. And always there's this discussion of what happened behind the scenes. But it doesn't change the fact that there is this legacy of an entity that hasn't been performing as one would hope or expect, and monies that have been allocated to fix it periodically that haven't necessarily manifested what they need to either, that the Bahamian people are now at a stage of thinking about. So who was the problem is a secondary question. How does this get fixed, and how do we reasonably believe that it will be fixed, and what are the steps that need to happen to bring that forward, in truth, are probably what's much more important. And that goes back to these concepts of transparency and accountability. And there are mechanisms in place. As a quasi-governmental state-owned enterprise, it has requirements on procurement reporting, on financial reporting, understanding that there are metrics and management components that could be looking at how this thing works or doesn't work. And so the clarity of have contracts been signed or not been signed, and who's in, all of that is very hard for the day-to-day person to understand when you absolutely understand the impact of I didn't have power for the last 16 hours, couldn't sleep because it's one of the hottest summers on record, and all of the things that then go on in your day-to-day life. So I do think that there is this easy political spin that happens at every administration about what was and why this is, but the dialogue on what's going to be fixed has to be grounded in a much deeper and more important two-way dialogue.
What is the effect as well of the report that we saw this week, where you have literally a handful of employees receiving more than $500,000 in overtime, and you look at that, and this is, as you said, a quasi-government corporation. These are public funds. These are monies that you and I are spending on electricity. The government is also putting into this corporation that are being, let's call it what it is, mismanaged.
Right.
When you see something like that happening as well, how does that, again, erode public trust, create this skepticism, and then even raise more questions about the management of these public corporations that our tax dollars are funding?
Right. I obviously, and you also, to be honest, this is a slice, right? We're just looking at this one thing in the midst of what all of this is. It's a digestible slice. We all get our mind around it. There's a lot of concern and alarm, but what led into that is really important to pay attention to. And what brings us out of it is essential. Our fundamental belief is that there needs to be this stronger level of participatory governance, that there has to be a space where stakeholders, people that are most affected by these things that are happening at a governing level, are being given information that is clear, objective, access to decisions and discussions that can make a difference, and then see how that input translates into action, movement, struggles, and that they're also aware, you can't just promise things are going to be good, that they're aware of some of the challenges, right? We're in an environment where it's very rare that anybody ever takes blame for a thing, right? Or accepts that we didn't do this thing, this led to, yet obviously that going back decades is what leads us to where we are. We all are working with limited resources in struggle, in an environment of struggle, to work across silos, to ensure that there's a coordinated effort. And how do we fix that? Ultimately, it starts by being clear as to where we are and what role do we have in bringing that forward. And it's equally government, the citizens, our private sector, the media, our academia. All of us have something to contribute, but if it's all held that this is government and in the hands of one thing, and their presentation becomes, it's good or it's bad, believe me, we'll get there, it's too little for our current environment and the needs that we have.
Matt, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. You know, I was gonna bring in another question about, you know, how does, I'm being told we can take the final. How would the Freedom of Information Act help to quell a lot of this, help to position the government in a way that it is seen to be transparent, that the information is there? How would a Freedom of Information Act have fixed all of this? Or could potentially fix
it instills a culture. It instills a culture whereby the balance between citizen and government is a little more even, because Freedom of Information Acts establish that if you need information, you can go request it. So if something is said, there's a capacity to verify. Is that true, accurate? Can I see it for myself? Which tends to lead that governments bring more information out proactively. They share more, and citizens are brought in fundamentally earlier. The great news here, though, is that we have a number of mechanisms that if we were able to move them forward, they're already on our books, would bring a lot of that culture forward. Freedom of information, the ombudsman, the independent commission of investigations, the protected disclosures, a revision of our current public disclosures, the full development of our Procurement Act, which includes not just government contracts, but state-owned enterprise contracts, the level of regularized reporting that's supposed to be maintained by all of those. If those things were in place, things that we have on the law and just not have been brought forward, a lot of this becomes a lot more available for information. People will see, you're able to kind of make a determination, is this political agenda, or is this really the current state of what we are? Am I hearing from my side or the other side that information, I can buy it not just because I believe in the person, but also because there's something for me to check and confirm. That's powerful.
Yeah. Matt, thank you very much again. You know, we ended as we started the need for, I call it that pesky Freedom of Information Act.
Critical Freedom of Information Act.
We can't seem to get. Thank you very much, Matt. Appreciate it. Thank you for always coming and providing us context.
Anytime.
And helping us to navigate through a lot of the noise that is out there on either side about what's happened. And so thank you very much. And continue, you know, the work of org. What you do is very important.
Thank you, sir.
And I think sometimes people don't realize how important it is to have that entity that's helping us to understand, but also that's helping us to hold our leaders accountable.
Excellent.
Very important.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Stick with us. We have some final thoughts right after this. Public finance can be complicated. Public accountability shouldn't be. Governments must have enough flexibility to respond to national needs, invest in infrastructure, and make difficult financial decisions. But the greater the discretion, the larger the sum of money involved, the more important transparency becomes. Because ultimately, accountability isn't about assuming wrongdoing. It's about ensuring that citizens never have to rely solely on assurances when records, institutions, and laws were created specifically to provide answers. Our thanks to Marlon Johnson and Matt Aubry for helping us to work through those questions tonight. And thank you, as always, for joining the conversation. I'm Jerome Sawyer, and we'll see you next time right here on The Record. Good night.